Well, welcome everybody to this, our third lecture on the politics of international criminal justice. I'm excited to have you back and to have the opportunity to share some of the things I've been thinking about and working on in this area for a little while now. So the plan for today is as follows. We're going to be discussing a range of things that I hope tease out for you the basic idea about instrumentalization of international criminal justice for political ends. So one component of the dialectic relationship between moral outrage on the one hand and a sense of accountability and the need for that on one hand. And then on the other, the sort of the politics that infuse international criminal justice because, as we learned from Schwarzenberger, the global legal order isn't all that amenable to just inserting a criminal law aspect into international relations. And so what we're looking at today are some of the politics of how the global legal order and power within that global legal order distorts a very basic model of criminal law enforcement once it's transposed internationally. So here are some of the things that I hope that we could do together over the coming hour. At the end of this class, I really hope you have a sensitivity to the different political agendas that states may have to international criminal law. And by that I mean that, different countries have different agendas, they have different sensitivities, they have different priorities. And I'm hoping to encourage you to think about the politics of international criminal law from that disaggregated perspective that is sensitive to the political values and approaches that differ from one state to the next. We will say more about that momentarily. I want to introduce you to the idea that other actors play important roles in the construction of international criminal law, and in particular, I want to invite you to think about businesses. I want you to think about civil society. There are a range of different constituents that play an important role, and I can tell you some sort of stories about the significance of those different actors as we go. I sort of mentioned at the outset, I think that from teaching this and other classes over the last, say, 12 to 15 years, my sense is that students really enjoy anecdotes more than anything. And so I try to build as many as I can into my teaching. So a core part of what I hope to do with you in the next hour is just tell you stories about the politics of international criminal justice, some of which I've been involved in, others of which I sort of learned vicariously through others, but in a way that I hope is helpful to you in understanding the sort of political issues that I'm hoping you come away with. There's also an idea that I want to explore with you as part of this process, which is popularized by a book by an author called Catherine Sickink, where she describes the rise of international criminal justice over the last several decades as a justice cascade. It's an important idea, and I want to explore it with you and plot, I guess, its relationship with everything that we've discussed in the class up until this point, and some of the things that we will go through today. So again, let me just reiterate the importance of what I call the onion factor, which is things become more complex and interesting as you take each and every layer of the onion off. Probably a better metaphor for it is that I really want to encourage you to triangulate and build connections between just different aspects of what we've been learning in terms of the history, the critique, basic ideas, aspirations of international criminal law. In each class, I want to encourage you to try and draw connections between different classes. I think doing that will really help you understand the field well and develop your own particular position about it. The justice cascade is one useful way to do that. And 5 is really just what I emphasized a moment ago, and that is that I hope you develop a keener sense of the politics and their interrelationship with other topics in the course. So without further ado, let me describe an exercise that we can do in the 20 minutes that we have together. That we can do in the 20 minutes we have together today, if that's your preference. It is an exercise that if we were meeting in person, I would have perhaps begun with, because it's a way in which I sort of invite you to thinking about the politics of international criminal law in a disaggregated way. That is, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Not all states perceive it the same way. In fact, some states are very for it because they see international rule of law as a means of offsetting their lack of political power on a global level, whereas more powerful states don't view it that way. They view military and economic power as sufficient, and international criminal justice as posing more of a threat than a benefit. So I wanted to sort of show you this exercise and invite you to think about it as you prepare for our class together. We can do it if there's a preference for doing it in person. So usually what I do in these courses when they're in person is I assign people countries. And I assign them countries and invite them to do a little bit of research about that country to sort of help them develop an idea of whether that particular country would be interested in joining the International Criminal Court. Again, let me say, I think the International Criminal Court is a little bit overblown in this field. Really, the core engine for international criminal accountability lies with national courts, but the International Criminal Court nonetheless is an important consideration in the work that we're doing. And in a way, if you think about it, it's a fairly bizarre idea to ask a state to join an international criminal court. It's saying, well, you know how you guys like rise up and commit atrocities from time to time, and how states kind of lose their mind at a relatively surprising frequency. Well, why don't you agree that when you do that, we will prosecute you? Oh, what a strange proposition, because generally when we do that sort of stuff, we like to get away with it. So it's sort of an interesting and a little bit counterintuitive idea. I guess the response is, well, we're not going to do it, but we're going to bind our future governments. It's a little bit complicated because, well, many of the countries that sign on have long histories of atrocities. Perhaps all countries have long histories of atrocities. But it's just an interesting sort of like set of thought processes to decide whether you would join an institution like that. And I want to start encouraging you to think through those issues. So the sorts of questions I ask are whether you would join the International Criminal Court, whether you support international criminal law in other contexts, because what you'll see about these politics of international criminal law is that states are very enthusiastic about the prospect when it involves prosecuting Rwandans or people in the former Yugoslavia, but very considerably more constrained when it may have implications for themselves, which I guess is natural, although the hypocrisy is a little troubling. I want to invite you, in relation to the country that I assigned, to think about what political issues drive your stance on international criminal law. And let me give you a particular example. It's really interesting as you sort of work in this field to realize that states have and cultures have sore points that are very sensitive and that really you can't bring up in an easy fashion without touching on and triggering sort of a trauma that is so sensitive. And so to give you an example, the atrocities committed in Algeria by France and against France were really such a sensitive issue in France for the longest time. And those atrocities explain how, in the original Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, there was a term inserted indicating that states could choose to incorporate war crimes 7 years later after a long and political process. And the reason that was inserted was because of politics in France around war crimes committed in Algeria, a topic that's immensely political. And so clearly, exposure to that type of liability, if you are French, is one of the key issues that's driving your sensitivity to the role of international criminal law. You might also be sensitive about the role of French collaboration during the Second World War, which is to a significant degree an untold story, and again, for obvious reasons, highly sensitive. All countries have these sorts of histories to some extent. I'm not trying to demonize France in particular. We could look at them from a perspective in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Germany, etc., etc., etc. So I just wanted to start you thinking about ways in which political issues within your own constituency might affect your vision of international criminal justice. And then I also wanted you to think a little bit about under what circumstances your position may change, and if there are those sorts of circumstances, what they might be. And we can talk through those a little bit momentarily. I guess the upshot of what I'm trying to say for you is that like different countries have different experiences with international criminal justice, and different countries have different economic and military power. Different countries have different exposure to the norms that we're discussing. And so it stands to reason that the politics of international criminal justice are disaggregated, they're plural, and very interesting. So I thought what I would do is just list all of these anecdotes and start telling you stories about them. So I spoke a little bit last time about Allied atrocities in World War II. And I don't want to say too much more about that, except I think to add from World War I that really there was a lot of literature, even within Britain, about the ways the British Army was manufacturing what was described as atrocity propaganda. That is, in order to sort of galvanize support for a war that was spectacularly brutal in terms of the effect of soldiers. I mean, trench warfare, if you know anything about the First World War, I mean, what an insane psychic experience. And, as a manifestation of this, it's the returning soldiers who had shell shock from being exposed to that. I mean, what an amazing situation. And it was very difficult to generate political support locally for the continuation of that war, which may actually, as I draw the connection now, which may actually have led the Allies to believe that morale bombing would be effective in the Second World War, because they had such tremendous difficulty generating morale and continued morale for World War I, knowing, that this sort of like insanity of trench warfare was destroying so many men and boys. So there's a lot of very interesting literature about atrocity propaganda and the ways in which the idea that Germany was committing atrocities was used to galvanize support. And then subsequently, a sense that, well, in order to justify and to appease a public that was so damaged by decisions to continue war for such a long period of time during the First World War, that trials and this idea of war guilt became an essential mechanism as sort of justification, political justification. So to what extent, the idea is first that the other side and only the other side is committing atrocities, and that there are the sort of like an amplitude which is off the scale, generates a sort of internally a willingness to continue armed violence, which creates tremendous violence. And then after the fact, because you've whipped up such fervor around the idea that atrocities were the basis for which you were engaged in war, the idea of holding people accountable becomes sort of a necessary political commitment. So what an interesting idea, right? What an interesting idea to sort of fold the notion of atrocity propaganda into the ways in which governments generate support for armed violence. And we see this in different ways, shapes, and forms. Probably the modern manifestation of this is humanitarian intervention, where you demonize the foreign government as committing crimes against humanity, and crimes against humanity, international criminal law becomes a basis for imperialistic intervention. So one has to be careful about that. There's a long history of it, and there's a sort of a concern that ultimately the politics of international criminal justice may be that it is neo-colonial and imperialistic in structure. So let me move to the second story about the UN Security Council Sudan referral to the ICC without expenses. So we'll discuss the structure of the International Criminal Court more later on in the course. But one of the things I hope you picked up from the last lecture that I think is really structurally distinct about the International Criminal Court is that it develops in such a way that is an attempt to correct some of the structural difficulties, if you will, with previous iterations of international criminal justice. So you'll remember, Leipzig trials, they're pretty much forced on the Germans. Nuremberg and Tokyo are very much forced upon the vanquished enemy. Ad hoc tribunals forced on former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in a different way by a different party. That's the UN Security Council, but nonetheless, they're all after the fact. They're all created after atrocities are taking place. And the International Criminal Court, in a way, attempts to correct all of that by creating a treaty body that states opt into, they voluntarily consent, and the court only has jurisdiction over atrocities committed within states that are consenting or by nationals of states that are consenting. And that's really quite a radical departure from the models, plural, that came previously. There is one exception in the ICC statute, and that is that the UN Security Council can refer cases to the ICC even when those countries haven't consented. And so this is a sort of a mechanism within the ICC statute that allows the ICC statute to allows the International Criminal Court to approximate to an ad hoc tribunal. And so let me make that concrete. Sudan is a country that had not ratified the ICC statute. Sudan was nonetheless a site of very important atrocities. And, one of the interesting things about working in this field is the sort of relationship between public and academic debate, and then sort of the lived felt experience of being there and seeing it yourself. And so at different junctures, there were people discussing whether Sudan was a genocide. And these discussions were very interesting in an academic and public political space. They're, the atrocities are of this amplitude, and these are the dynamics in the atrocities. Maybe, maybe not. And then I had a close friend who went to South Sudan and would emerge with a very different sort of emotional valence, which it's a genocide. And so there's always this interesting sort of relationship between distance, and that distance permits a sort of a degree of emotionality that's just detached that isn't really available if one's sort of directly witnessing and experiencing these things. So what was interesting about the Sudan situation is that despite intense U.S. hostility to the International Criminal Court, which is now hyper intense under Trump, we can come to that in a moment. Despite this, the UN Security Council agreed to refer Sudan to the International Criminal Court. And by that I mean the International Criminal Court would have jurisdiction over international crimes perpetrated in Sudan, despite the fact that the Sudanese government never agreed to the ICC's jurisdiction. So again, it effectively made the ICC like an ad hoc tribunal. But there are two elements that I want to suggest are interesting and, in a way, telling about the double standards that permeate the field and that we should, in a way, expect, given that we don't live in a world government that has its own law enforcement agency and where power is evenly distributed between underlying actors. So one of the exceptions that was necessary, that got sort of loaded in and included in the Security Council referral of Sudan to the International Criminal Court, was language that explicitly exempted nationals of parties, of states not party to the International Criminal Court who are peacekeepers, from the scope of the ICC's jurisdiction, because the US was adamant that no American peacekeeper would fall within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And so the double standard is sort of overt and glaring. It's like, well, we'll refer every Sudanese in the country to the International Criminal Court and every other actor, but not American peacekeepers. It's like, well, I mean, could you have a more overt double standard? And then one of the controversies also is that one of the ways in which states control the efficacy and mandate of the International Criminal Court is by providing with a grossly inadequate budget for its purposes. I mean, I won't go too much into the budget, but it's deplorably low, given the mandate assigned to an institution that is addressing atrocities the world over, and given the frequency with which these atrocities take place. And in that context, the Security Council referred the Sudanese government to the International Criminal Court, but did not pay for the cases that would take place under that rubric. And so it was very much, again, an element of political control, because if the International Criminal Court wanted to bring these cases, and in a way they were some of the worst human rights violations of the period, it would have to spend its own money that states other than P5 countries were providing to the International Criminal Court, instead of having P5 countries who wanted this work done foot the bill. So again, it's a complicated politics, which risks being the sort of handmaiden of power, and sometimes the double standards, like in this instance, are really overt. In other places, there are instances where the use of Security Council vetoes is sufficient to defeat ICC action. And this was true in Syria in 2014, where both China and Russia vetoed a draft resolution to have the International Criminal Court intervene in Syria. And Syria, again, is one of these places, it happened directly, where, there's sort of like this concern in the field, and it's like, wow, have you seen what's happening in Syria? Really, it seems pretty intense, and really something should be done about it. It's really stunning. And then one of my friends works on Syria and emerges, what are you people thinking about Syria? Why are you not concerned about Syria? It's insane what's happening in Syria. And there's this constant relationship between sort of, as I say, abstraction and from the lived realities of atrocities, and then engagement with the lived experience of atrocities, and a very intense emotional experience, which in large part has been a defining vector in the trajectory of international criminal justice. We can say more about that in person, but I really do think, I worked on the Rwandan genocide and had an experience of that myself many years ago, which largely still animates most of my work. And so I do think it's an important determinant of the field. I'll keep going down the list and discuss universal jurisdiction in Brussels. And universal jurisdiction is an interesting concept that I'm happy that we are now sort of introducing you to whet your appetite about the concept and how it is differentiated from the International Criminal Court. We have a class towards the end of this course on universal jurisdiction. It's super interesting and in a way involves a set of politics that are different from those that might obtain at the International Criminal Court. But there are important continuities, and I'll talk to you about those continuities now. So the essence of universal jurisdiction is that international crimes are so serious, they're so grave, that any state can prosecute individuals for international crimes regardless of where the crime took place. So the crime doesn't have to take place in your own jurisdiction. Regardless of who the victims are, the victims don't have to be nationals of your own country. In some iterations, whether or not you have the defendant in your territory. And so it's universal in the sense that it's like countries like Canada, for instance, will prosecute Rwandans for their involvement in the Rwandan genocide, even though the Rwandan wasn't in Canada at the time, even though the victims of the Rwandan genocide weren't Canadians. It's an assertion of highly permissive jurisdiction over criminal law that isn't normally capable or possible for other sorts of international crime. For other sorts of crimes. So, if I commit a theft in Rwanda, then Australia can't assert jurisdiction because I'm not an Australian national, because I didn't commit the crime in Australia. There has to be some linkage normally between the jurisdiction and the criminal offense committed. The crime didn't take place in Australia, as I say. Universal jurisdiction is an exception to that rule. It allows states to prosecute international crimes regardless of whether they took place. So to give you an example, in a really fascinating development whose politics we can discuss, sort of south-south cases, recently in Argentina, Argentine court commenced a case for crimes against humanity and genocide in Myanmar. There was no one from Myanmar was living in Argentina in particular. The crimes didn't take place in Argentina. You get the picture. Let me say a little bit more about universal jurisdiction. It's important to your understanding. You know the core problem that we started with? We saw it really from Leipzig and thereafter. The problem is, the powers that are able to commit international crimes, they generally have captured law enforcement in their countries, and they generally but not invariably, are authoritarian in nature, and so can keep themselves in power for very substantial periods of time. And, if we're serious about accountability, which we were certainly very concerned about it post-World War II, and sort of a growth industry in the justice cascade that we'll talk about momentarily after the 1990s. If we're serious about this, we have to start thinking about different international legal doctrine and strategies for holding people accountable. One strategy was the non-applicability of statutes of limitations, meaning, we can prosecute you into your 90s. If we'll drag you before a court just before death in your 90s and prosecute you for your role in the Holocaust, which is still happening in Germany. Still cases in Europe prosecuting Nazis for their role in the Holocaust in their 90s. So statutes of the non-applicability of statutes of limitations is one area. It's basically saying, you know what, we're going to outlast you. Like you will likely be able to insulate yourself politically for like, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, but we will outlast you and you will ultimately be held accountable even late in your life. And through that commitment, we're hoping to sort of distribute a deterrence for international crimes across a vastly broader notion, a vastly broader set of actors that might involve themselves in international crimes. And we're explicitly trying to address the problem that's at the heart of international criminal justice. That is, states that commit international crimes have generally insulated themselves from law enforcement in their own states. Another mechanism that we constructed to deal with the problem was universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is like, well, you've insulated yourself from law enforcement in your national setting. You control the judges and the prosecutors, and actually you harness them in bringing about the crimes against humanity or the genocide that we're concerned about. They played important roles in carrying out the atrocities, maybe vital roles in carrying out the atrocities we're concerned about. And so we're going to start harnessing foreign courts, foreign national courts, to do that work against you. And you know what? Any foreign national court can bring these cases, which means at a very minimum, you should be very concerned about traveling. Because if you travel to, say, England to get healthcare like Augusto Pinochet did, there may be some human rights group which says, listen, waltzes down to the court and dumps a dossier of human rights violations of you dropping 20,000 people out of planes. And a local court may say, oh, look at that. This bloke really is responsible for international crimes. Here's a message to the police to go and arrest him and he can stand trial here, etc., etc. There are more complications about universal jurisdiction that I hope we can go into, in particular the complications about who can begin the process. But in Belgium, there was an iteration for the longest time of universal jurisdiction, which is mandated in the Geneva Conventions and in other aspects of international law. There was an iteration that allowed anyone in public to file a case alleging international crimes. And if the case was on its face bona fide, if it was like substantiated and not ridiculous, then the Belgian prosecutor had a legal obligation to begin an investigation. That handed a lot of power to human rights organizations and groups of this sort to make complaints in a Belgian court. And Belgian prosecutors would be obliged to bring these cases. And then suddenly, these Belgian courts, because they were sort of like legally obliged to pursue them in good faith, suddenly they start indicting like Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel. And they start indicting all sorts of different actors. At one point in the process in Belgium, they indicted Tommy Franks, the American general in Iraq, and there were indictments for Donald Rumsfeld, the American Secretary of State. And at that juncture, the United States goes to Brussels and says, listen, either you change your universal jurisdiction rules, or we will remove NATO, the headquarters of NATO from Brussels. And so the Belgians changed their law. They shut it down. They shut it down on overt American pressure. Now, to make that even more complicated, the same week that this was taking place, Americans paid $20 million to have an American prosecutor installed in Sierra Leone at a special tribunal for Sierra Leone on the supposition that Al-Qaeda was using illegal exploitation of diamonds in Sierra Leone as a basis for terrorist financing. And so you again see this sort of like deep instrumentalization of harnessing international criminal justice for our own political advancement, while at the same time pulling all sorts of political levers to insulate ourselves from exposure to the same sorts of norms that we're using against other people. So again, in these sorts of circumstances, our ability to sort of draw a straight line between international criminal justice and any concept of justice, international criminal law and any concept of justice seems pretty tricky. Let me move on to talk to you a bit more about well, we've discussed France and war crimes. I think I'll do two more of these. Well, maybe one I worked on. So Todorovich's kidnapping. So Todorovic was an individual who was indicted by the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, and he was in Serbia during a period that there was a UN peacekeeping force called KFOR in Bosnia next door. And at one juncture, I think sort of a set of KFOR troops mounted sort of a nighttime incursion into Serbia and to detain Todorovic and spirited him quickly back over the border into Bosnia, where he was transferred to the ICTY. When he emerged in the ICTY, he said, actually, I want to contest the circumstances of my arrest. I mean, I was effectively kidnapped from Serbia because KFOR has no authority to detain anyone in Serbia. And I also want to make allegations about my mistreatment during the process. And under normal circumstances, like anyone who makes those sorts of claims in a criminal trial, it's like, well, all right, tell the police to give us information about the circumstances of your arrest and, information about how you were treated in that process. That's a normal judicial and an important judicial function, right? I mean, that's what courts are there to do, to protect individuals against getting unlawfully detained and being tortured in the process. And so the court says, show us the info, NATO. Show us what you got. We want to scrutinize this. And I worked on the appeal. Every single NATO government filed documents to the court saying, sometimes overtly, well, all of them said this. The only variation was how explicit the threat was. But all of them said, if you make us provide this information, we'll never arrest another person for you. You have no police force. You are dependent on us. If you make us provide this information about essentially a covert operation to detain one of your indictees for you, and if you start scrutinizing this in a public forum, we will not arrest anyone again. And the case went away because there was a plea agreement, so the issue was never adjudicated. The case went away. Todorovic pled guilty to lesser charges, served a shorter period of time, and voila, that was it. So quite an interesting moment where, as a young lawyer, I'm exposed to the political realities of the politics and the way these politics are infused into judicial process. What should we talk about? The ICC, the UK, and Iraq. So the International Criminal Court technically has jurisdiction over British nationals wherever they are, because the UK has signed and ratified the ICC statute, and as a consequence, the ICC has jurisdiction over all international crimes committed in Great Britain, B, all crimes committed by British nationals anywhere in the world. Those are the two sort of essential elements of the ICC's jurisdiction, and then there's also ad hoc referrals by the Security Council, but that's not pertinent presently. And so one of the issues that arises is that, there's substantial allegations that UK troops have been torturing and murdering detainees in the Iraq War since 2003. And, well, let's backtrack momentarily into the history of international criminal law to understand that accusing your own soldiers of committing international crimes is a fairly bitter pill to swallow. Not many states are all that enthusiastic to do it. We learn this from Leipzig and every other instance. But the very structure of international criminal justice at the International Criminal Court accepts that. One of the reasons we created an international crime is we're like, well, those who commit international crimes are pretty reluctant to hold themselves responsible. This we know, it's like the core problem. And so the ICC exists as an institution to sort of scrutinize that process and say, yo, UK, actually there's quite a lot of evidence. And so, now there have been several iterations of public inquiries in Britain into allegations. There's been a very interesting documentary to say all of those allegations, or all of those sort of public inquiries have been a farce that are bent on exonerating their own nationals. Oh, you mean sort of vaguely akin to Leipzig? We shouldn't be surprised by this, right? There's a very long history that suggests this is going to be the core problem. So there's recently been an election process for a new prosecutor in the International Criminal Court, a process that I was sort of involved in when I attended the Assembly of States Parties at the International Criminal Court at the end of last year. And, you meet with representatives of the British government, and this is pretty much their only concern. This is pretty much, they're straight to it. All right, well, this is our prime concern. Is the next prosecutor going to be someone who scrutinizes the British investigation into allegations of international crimes in the UK? And so these are the politics. And they're important politics, but they're also politics that are tricky to sort of extricate yourself from if you're an international criminal court, because you can't have no friends. You're dependent on states, and you're dependent on states to perform arrests, to finance the institution. So it's an interesting question about independence, and it's an interesting question about how politics of particular institutions and particular states interface to generate international criminal justice. And it's an interesting moment where you start to reflect on the relationship between this idea of moral outrage and the desire for accountability versus the sort of politics that I'm describing, which transform those desires in ways which that sometimes undermine international criminal law's claim as a representative of international criminal justice. One last example that I wanted to share with you, which I think is important and is important not just in the context, but is important as a sort of a structural reflection of a similar dynamic in international criminal justice, and that's crimes by the Rwandan Patriotic Front in Rwanda. So I'm not sure if people know so much about the history of the Rwandan genocide, but in a very fast-forwarded version, Hutus are committing a genocide in Rwanda that kills a number of people that sort of, for which there is a degree of difference of opinion, but I think consensus settles around 800,000 people are killed by Hutus in 1994 in Rwanda. And the Security Council is largely silent because the bodies of American troops have been dragged through the cities of Mogadishu several months prior, and there's really no appetite for sending troops on the ground to sort of prevent a genocide like this. So ultimately, the force that puts an end to the genocide is a force of largely Tutsi soldiers who come down into Rwanda from Uganda and overthrow the Hutu government and expel Hutus into the east of the Congo, which is just neighboring. And so in this context, it's very clear that the vast number of atrocities that took place were carried out by Hutu génocidaires that killed, as I say, around 800,000 people. But in the process of ousting that Hutu regime in 1994, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi regime currently in power, is estimated to have massacred 50,000 people. That's a lot of people. And it's not trivial. And it was not necessary. So part of the sort of Achilles heel for the Rwanda Tribunal was always, well, what are we going to do about the massacres carried out by the victims? Well, the massacres carried out by the ethnic entity that is certainly the greatest victim of these atrocities. And the criticism is, listen, if you don't do anything about it, it's again victor's justice. It's again like the victor gets to prosecute the other side, and the victor's atrocities brushed under the carpet, and it mirrors Nuremberg and Tokyo. And yet we have moved on from that, right? Like we've learned from that. This is a process of progression, isn't it, in international criminal justice? And the notion that we now have a neutral arbiter in international criminal justice in the form of the United Nations means that, well, we're actually going to prosecute people from the RPF, right? I mean, let's be smart about it. Let's maybe wait till the end and on one of the final acts of the institution just to sort of appease its image as impartial and objective will be to bring cases against individuals senior in the RPF, even though they're in power in Rwanda. The short of that process was that Rwanda said, listen, if you ever investigate any RPF cases, we will never cooperate with you again. You will never have a single witness for your other cases. We won't guarantee the security of your investigators in Rwanda. And effectively, your project shuts down. So there's a concern that the need for, and this is a sort of a concern that plays out in different dynamics in different institutions, that the concern for cooperation with governments is often deeply problematic because the governments may not have especially strong democratic credentials. They may have a stack of blood on their own hands, and effectively those governments may be instrumentalizing international criminal justice institutions to sort of instantiate a new form of victor's justice. In the case of the ICTR, the then chief prosecutor was effectively removed by the Security Council for insisting on this. And so the upshot of the whole process was that RPF atrocities were never prosecuted. And, you know, if you look into the history of the Great Lakes region, after one of the strange things about international criminal law is it tends to sort of like take these slices in time, like 1994 in Rwanda, and then it sort of hyper focuses on those slices of time and the large indifference that predated 1994 is then sort of revisited after 1994, and no one pays attention to the fact that atrocities of a similar amplitude, hundreds of thousands of people killed in the Congo in 1996. There doesn't seem to be real sort of appetite internationally to engage with this. And so, you know, one of the difficult things I think about working in international criminal justice is that the same sort of indifference that allowed the Rwandan genocide to go unchecked at the time really isn't an aberration. It's sort of relatively constant. And international criminal justice highlights just an element of some dynamic within it, and then just divorces itself and washes its hands of a continuation of exactly those sorts of dynamics, only because they don't fall within some sort of jurisdictional mandate. So those things become problematic. And if you're engaged with the emotionality that I described with you earlier, if you're one of the people coming back and saying, it's amazingly violent in Syria, what are you people doing? How are you ignoring this? It's ridiculous. It's so crazy violent. If you're engaged in that type of sort of emotional exposure, then the sorts of political anomalies that I'm describing to you, they're not like interesting intellectual problems. They're like serious personal crises. So it's an interesting relationship, and one that I want to sort of come back and circle around as we continue with our discussions. We have still 10 minutes. I think I'm going to say just a very brief word about other political actors and the politics of other political actors. I had a conversation with one of the former prosecutors, chief prosecutors, a woman named Louise Arbour, who I admire a great deal. And she talked to me about the role of both academics and civil society in ways that I hadn't fully reflected on. One of those insights, I think, is that, most domestic prosecutors, they really couldn't care less what civil society, meaning NGOs, and they're really not that concerned about civil society in any meaningful way. And as for academics, well, I guess that varies a little bit. The academics are a more important political and legal force in, say, Germany. But in the vast majority of the world, I suspect that academics don't matter too much in the execution of prosecutorial decision-making. But that's not true in international criminal law, because really a substantial portion of the political drive for international criminal justice came from civil society. And academics play a really significant role in propagating the field. So there are interesting politics of both of those different constituencies. I'll tell you one story about international criminal law as a success story for the human rights movement, and the ways that sort of moral absurdity were used as a means of generating political support for that program. And if you recall the set of lectures that I gave at the Collège de France, I talk about this idea of moral absurdity as a recurrent mechanism for generating political appetite for international prosecutions. And really, the moral absurdity aspect is pushing at the moral valence of, it's insane to let someone like Mengele get away with it, right? Like, despite the politics, we are going to persist in seeking accountability because otherwise we live in a morally absurd universe. And so the story that I like to tell about this is what I call the Geneva absurdity. And this was really sort of the rally cry for many in the human rights movement during a period where there was very little international criminal law. And then when the United States was sort of ascendant in the Security Council, this agenda emerged as sort of vindication of this particular metaphor that I call the Geneva absurdity. The Geneva absurdity goes like this. If you kill one person, you are investigated and tried. Often you'll receive a life sentence. If you can't kill 10 people, you're investigated, tried, and almost invariably will receive a life sentence. In some places, you'll be sentenced to death. But if you kill 10,000 people, you're invited to Geneva for peace talks. And so the idea of moral absurdity is, well, that's insane, right? If you scale up your violence, you get better treatment. That can't be right. International criminal justice is the mechanism that renders logical our criminal law response to mass violence. It's the thing that corrects this absurd situation. Take a deep breath. Think this through. There were people dropping 20,000 human beings out of airplanes over this period and getting away with it. Amazing. Can you think that through? They're getting away with it. Amazing commentary on the state of the world, don't you think? So that is an interesting political dilemma. The other set of actors that I wanted to suggest to you as playing a really important role in atrocity all the way through history and right to the contemporary moment are corporations. And corporations were important in all sorts of ways. They really were at the avant-garde of colonialism, and often it was like states reluctantly sometimes following corporations into colonial situations for exploitation of especially human and natural resources. The human aspect of that dynamic was slavery, and the natural resources dynamic was pillage of natural resources. Both of those things are international crimes. And so there's a sense in which, the global inequality that's so transparent internationally presently is really a function of two very important international crimes that are enriched Europe and the United States of America. And what's really kind of a political anomaly is that after the Second World War, there was really a broad recognition of the role that corporations played in the rise of National Socialism and the accountability that they held. There was very detailed plans for a second Nuremberg trial, international trial of business leaders they called industrialists that didn't come about for various reasons we can discuss. But a series of business people were prosecuted and convicted for their role in international crimes. But what's bizarre is that there have been very few cases like that. Van Anrant is one that I mentioned to you, but there's been very few cases like that in international institutions. In fact, none before ad hoc tribunals, before the Special Court for Sierra Leone, before the International Criminal Court. None against business people since 1993, since the modern rise of international criminal justice. And so it's sort of bizarre politically because there's something about modern international criminal justice that's really highly regressive. And so if I was to, and yet, for instance, over that same period, these institutions have prosecuted quite a number of presidents of countries. And so if I were to generate a political absurdity that mimics some of the sort of absurdities that have given rise to the development of the field, it would be this. What's the best way to get away with an international crime? Incorporate. It's even more successful than becoming president of your country. So again, I highlight this because there are other actors, and the politics of these actors is interesting and complex. We're sort of coming to the end of our time. I want to say a little bit about Catherine Sickink's idea of a justice cascade. And it's a significant idea. It's an important book that talks to really a substantial deluge of cases over the past, say, 30 to 40 years. But in a way, what I wanted to suggest to you from our historical context is that really that deluge dates at least to the end of the First World War. There were like 1,600 cases in Belgium and France alone after the First World War. 3 to 4% of Europe was prosecuted after the Second World War. I mean, an astronomical number. And so the modern iteration of international criminal justice is very much a continuity of that sudden turn to international criminal law, to criminal law rather, as a means of addressing the consequences of mass violence. And there are interesting dynamics that are at play presently. We can talk about the politics of international courts more and the way in which Trump in particular has made it a criminal offense now in the United States to support the work of the International Criminal Court. Who knows whether that will continue? But that in of itself is a very direct attack on the sort of accountability agenda that we're talking about here. There's an interesting rise in universal jurisdiction cases. The ones I mentioned in Argentina, the South-South cases are very interesting. There are trials in national courts as part of transitional justice in Greece, in Portugal, Argentina, Peru. And transitional justice, again, is this moment where the whole idea of political entities that commit international crimes as being insulated from law enforcement because they control courts changes as there's a change of regime, and suddenly they're exposed. And so the idea of transitional justice is, well, how do we deal with our violent past? There's also a very interesting set of cases that I call acculturation cases. And by that I mean something very significant relative to Leipzig is national courts prosecuting their own nationals for international crimes. And the Dutch led the way with cases like Van Anrant. There's another one called Kouwenhoven. The Belgians prosecuted someone called de Sedelier for pillaging diamonds from Sierra Leone. Unfortunately, he committed suicide before the case came to trial. The Blackwater cases that I described are significant in this context, and the German courts are now still prosecuting Nazis in their 90s for international crimes. There's also leverage cases, which I think are interesting. So we can talk more about a case, I say by extrapolation because it occurred within the Alien Tort Statute, of prosecuting a major provider of internet services and computer services in China, and the company was Yahoo. Yahoo effectively complied with a Chinese legal order to disclose the name and identity of a dissident within China who was making pro-democracy and pro-human rights statements through a pseudonym online in China. The allegations in the case are that as a consequence of this disclosure, which Yahoo knew would take place, this individual was tortured, sentenced to 13 years hard labor, purely for pro-democracy, pro-human rights critiques of the government, and that Yahoo was, by implication, complicit in human rights violations that took place in China. And what's, I think, interesting here is an attempt to leverage human rights performance in China by focusing on the exposure of actors outside that jurisdiction to law enforcement cases. I've run my time now, but I hope I've substantiated some of the sort of initial ideas of what our learning objectives would be for this particular session, and that this information provides, again, a platform for a discussion that we can have about the politics of international criminal justice momentarily. Thanks so much.